So over the years in the MCU and the Infinity Saga and the Multiverse Saga, we went through a lot of underrated movies and a lot of underrated shows as well. I think a lot of movies, especially in the Multiverse Saga, went under the radar and were faded out because of the state of the MCU and because they dropped a lot of stinkers like Quantumania and a few shows that didn't do very well. I think a lot of shows and movies got faded out, which, did pretty well with fans' expectations and the audience reviews. I think even in the Infinity Saga, there are a lot of movies that people don't rate as highly as certain movies in the MCU, which I will be starting today, and I will be starting this series today on the channel, which is going to be me watching MCU movies and shows, and then doing a video on them explaining why I think they're underrated or maybe even overrated. But I'm going to start with a few underrated ones first and then maybe get into some overrated ones. So if you guys do enjoy the series on the channel and want me to do a certain movie or show, please let me know. And let's get straight into it. Today we're going to be starting with Avengers Age of Ultron, which is one of my personal favourite MCU movies actually. It is in my top 5, and I think it is very mixed upon the fans, which is why I'm going to make a video on why I think it's underrated. Let's just get straight into it. So the first thing I have in mind for this is the introduction for Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, obviously Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Now, Quicksilver wasn't in the movie for long, but obviously Wanda Maximoff is a massive player in the MCU and a massive game changer. She's, beloved by the fans, and she's a massively important character going forward. And this movie sets her up perfectly, I think. It shows her, the backstory of the two and what they went through as children and their traumatic past. And obviously they were experimented on, so we got that hint at how they got their powers and what had been happening to them for the past few years. We hadn't really had mutants in the MCU, so these were the first two that we had. Realistically, from comics and comic book runs, those are mutants. So those are the first we had. And I think that they dive pretty well into their stories in Age of Ultron and set them both up for the future very well, or not both, because obviously Pietro died, in the movie at the end. But, Wanda Maximoff had a good start with this movie. I think it shows, why she, in the future when she goes through these traumatic events, this is a movie that sets that up and, explains what she was going through. So I really like that. I really like that they did this introduction with her in Age of Ultron and had her have a connection with Ultron and, Tony Stark and stuff like that. So I think it was a good introduction for her. And I really enjoyed her being in this movie. I think this is one of her, highlight movies. I think Elizabeth Olsen was perfect in this. And I think that they explained her character pretty well. And of course, a lot of other things that we have in this movie, and it is portrayed throughout the movie, is the emotional conflict between the Avengers. Now, obviously, we would dive more into this in Civil War, but this was just the setup for that, I think. Again, I have another thing of the build-up of tension between Steve and Tony for Civil War. I think throughout the movie, you see them both going through this phase with each other where they're arguing a lot, they're going against each other. Of course, most of the Avengers are against Tony in this movie because of his creation of Ultron. And I think that the emotional conflict between all of the Avengers is very nice to see. We got to see it in the first Avengers movie, and I think this movie dives into it a lot more, which we of course would expect for that to happen. It just made a lot of sense to see the emotional conflict between the Avengers, and I think it made a lot of sense to see that between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark, because we started to see that I guess aggression between the two and that tension between the two in the first Avengers movie. And of course, as time goes on, that we see that in Age of Ultron, and we see that in the future movies as well. Of course, they're friends, but they're both people that are very similar but very different in their own ways. So I think it's very nice to see the conflict they have with each other. And it was just really nice to see in this movie. And I think it also shows the ups and downs of the Avengers as well. I think they go through these high moments where they are the perfect amount of comedy in this movie, I think, which shows the ups with the Avengers, like the high moments, which was obviously in the party scene at the start of the movie where obviously Ultron makes his introduction. But all the Avengers are having a nice time. They're together after getting what they needed to get in the first act of the movie, completing their mission against Strucker, and it was really nice to see the togetherness that the Avengers had at the start, which we do see throughout the MCU, but I think Age of Ultron highlighted it really nicely that, the Avengers are a team and they're like a family, and I think this movie showed that really well. Of course, a family always comes with the low moments as well, which we did see in this movie, with the Avengers all being in there, split off into their own little bits. Natasha and Bruce were together a lot. Thor was off by himself doing his own stuff, like seeing the vision of the future with the Infinity Stones, which I'll get into later. And of course, Steve and Tony went through their ups and downs in this movie as well, like I just explained. They had their high moments, but they also had their low moments, which set up Civil War, which is a movie where, the Avengers are against each other. It's basically an Avengers movie. The tensions are high between all of the Avengers, and this Age of Ultron set that up very nicely. Another character that made this movie a perfect movie in my opinion, or not perfect, but a great movie in my opinion, was Ultron. I think Ultron is someone that we need to see more in the future of the MCU, which we will, and I can't wait to see him in the future of the MCU. But I think he was perfect in this movie. I think James Spader did an amazing job as Ultron. He's just a perfect fit for that character, and I can't wait to see what they do with him in Vision Quest. But yeah, he has some iconic scenes in Avengers: Age of Ultron. The one that we all know and love. And yeah, it's just a good movie to have him as the villain of, James Spader, and I think that there were some great fight scenes between Ultron and Tony Stark, obviously Iron Man. The ending scene when it's Ultron, his army against the Avengers. I think that's an incredible scene, one of the best in the MCU. And I think seeing Ultron in this movie is just a start of what we can see in the future of him. I think he's an underrated villain in the MCU, and I genuinely cannot wait to see what they do with him in the future. So I think this movie, portrays Ultron perfectly, and yeah, it really dives into the emotional side of his character, and his mission is obviously what was peace, but he then goes off into his own thing, which explains the horrors of AI and what it could really become and do to the world. So yeah, I think it was a joy to watch Ultron in this movie. And yeah, like I just said, the fight scenes in this movie, especially with Ultron, were really epic. I think they were really nicely done. The choreography was really good, and I think the opening scene specifically was the highlight of the movie. I think the ending battle with Ultron's army against the Avengers, that was really, really awesome to see. But I think the first bit when the opening of the movie with the Avengers trying to get Loki's staff, I think that's really the highlight of the movie when it comes to action scenes and the Avengers, like showing off the Avengers togetherness, I guess you could say. Like, it really does highlight that perfectly with the opening. And yeah, that obviously sets up the rest of the movie with the Mind Stone being a part of the staff, which then creates Vision, which was going to be used for Ultron. I think the start of the movie with that first fight scene, the first battle scene, that was perfect in my opinion. But yeah, the humour was another thing I wanted to get into, because I think in recent years, humour in the MCU has been used in the wrong places, and I think it's been used too much. Whereas in Age of Ultron, I think they used humour in the right places, like in the party scene when Ultron makes his introduction. They used humour in there when, Cap is almost lifting up Mjolnir. Like, we see humour in that scene between Tony Stark and War Machine, Rhodey. We see it in the right places in this movie. It's not constantly used. I think there's the right balance. I think Age of Ultron, they got that perfectly right, with the balance of humour and a serious tone. Of course, MCU movies have that comedic side to them, but in the Infinity Saga, it was used at a more balanced rate, not like they use now, where it's used unbalanced, and it's just used too much. I think this movie got that right, and that's really nice to see. I think that's what they should take notes from in future movies and use that, which I hope they do with the next two Avengers movies. They use humor right, and not like they have like Quantumania, for example. I get it's an Ant-Man movie, but they had Kang as the villain, and I think they should have used it, been more smart with it. And She-Hulk again is another example. They just use comedy too much and humor in the wrong places, and I think that they're going to get that right soon, and I hope that Age of Ultron can be that standout for them to go with. And dialogue in this movie was great. I should have said at the start of the video, I'm basing this off things that I guess people base off movies, MCU movies now. So dialogue, action scenes, choreography, stuff like that. The main parts of movies that people highlight the most, that is what I'm going to be going off. And dialogue is the next one. I think dialogue in this movie was great. Even to this day, 10 years later, after Age of Ultron's release, the dialogue of Ultron in that movie, and the dialogue between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, it's just it's perfect. I think it sets the future up, but it also is great for character development, which I will get into in a minute. I think the dialogue I think Ultron's the main standout. I think his some of his lines are on par with Thanos, maybe not as good as Thanos's in Infinity War, but they are just as good. People still bring them up and reference Ultron's lines to this day, and TikToks about them and everything. I think Ultron's dialogue is incredible, and it is something that is beloved, loved by the fans, and will always go back to. And I think hopefully they get that right with Ultron in the future as well, with when he comes back in Vision Quest. I think that, the dialogue was just used perfectly with Ultron specifically, but also the Avengers as well. The conflict and the tension between them when they're arguing about the creation of Ultron, when they're arguing about certain things in the movie, and the romance between, the build-up of the romance between Nat and Bruce. I mean, of course, they didn't really play off it after this, because Bruce disappeared and obviously returned in Ragnarok. But I think that the dialogue between the two really set them up nicely in this movie for what could have been and what we could have seen in the future. So I think that was really nice. I think the dialogue was used perfectly to portray that romance, and also portray the togetherness and the family that they had within the Avengers. I think, like I said earlier, the ups and downs, the dialogue really helped that, show the happy times and also the bad moments of the Avengers. Another introduction, like I said, with the movie, we got the introduction of Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. We also got the introduction of Vision. Now, Vision, of course, is a massive player for the Infinity Saga, plays a massive role in Infinity War. And they set that up in Age of Ultron. They set Infinity War up with, Thor's vision of, the Infinity Stones, and of course the creation of Vision with the Mind Stone, which plays a massive role at the end of Infinity War, when, I guess the whole movie is Thanos and the Black Order trying to get to the Vision so then they can get the Mind Stone, which was, I would arguably say is the most important stone in the movie. Of course, the Soul Stone as well, because the Soul Stone was, we didn't really know much about that going into Infinity War, so that was also a massively important part of the film. But all the Infinity Stones were important in that movie, but I think the two important ones that were used were the Mind Stone and the Soul Stone, which was set up in Age of Ultron, and I think it sets up Vision perfectly. He was a character that was loved by the fans, and I think it was a nice setup having him a link to Ultron in this movie. So, and of course we got at the end of the movie the post-credit scene with Thanos, which sets up Infinity War. So there was a lot of setup in this movie for future movies, but in its own right, it is a great movie. And the last thing I want to talk about is the character development for all the members of the team. Thor goes through his character development. I think the main character development that they go through is when Scarlet Witch puts the vision is in their mind of the past of what, Steve sees Peggy, Thor sees the Infinity Stones, which is, sets the future up. Natasha sees the past of the Red Room. And, of course, then we get that awesome scene between Hulk and Iron Man and the Hulkbuster scene. That's incredible. One of the best, I think, fight scenes in the MCU we have to this day. Really awesome to see that. And I'm glad we got this movie in general. I think it was a perfect movie to, you know, further develop the Avengers before going into the big two movies of Infinity War and Endgame. Of course, they go through more character development, like Hulk and Thor go through Ragnarok, and, you know, Civil War happens. So development does happen after this movie, but I think this movie does drive the Avengers, like, character development massively, I think, as a family, and also just their, you know, between each other, just how they interact in the future. I think Age of Ultron really does set this up perfectly for Infinity War and Endgame. And that's why I think Age of Ultron is just an underrated movie in the MCU, and I think should be highly rated on most people's lists of MCU movies. It's in my top 5. I'm not saying you have to enjoy it and love it, but, well, it has to be your favourite MCU movie, but I do think it deserves more credit for what it did for the MCU in the Infinity Saga and what it did for the Avengers and the characters in general. So, yeah, I hope you guys did enjoy the video today. I hope you guys can tell me down below what you think, and give me suggestions on what other movies and shows you'd want to see me review, and say, you know, what are underrated and overrated. I would love to know what your guys' opinion is. I may not be the best at this. You know, this is my first, you know, video of doing a ranking of what movie, you know, Age of Ultron being an underrated movie. So there's a lot to improve for me on this, but I hope you guys did enjoy. And yeah, give me some suggestions down below, and I'll see you in the next video.